Thank you, everyone, and thank you for bearing with us. We had some technical difficulties, as happens when you're dealing with multiple languages. So happy to have here with us today the Minister of Indigenous People from Brazil, Ms. Sônia Guajajara. We also have with us the Chairperson of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Mr. Dario Mejia Montalvo. And finally, we have with us the Indigenous rights leader of the Laikipia Maasai from Kenya, Mr. Ole Kaunga. And they're here because, as you know, today was the opening of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. They'll all deliver some opening remarks, and then we'll open it for questions. I just want to let you know that there is English to Spanish interpretation and also Portuguese interpretation, so please use your headphones. Okay, so we will start with the Minister. Ms. Guajajara, please, go ahead.
Olá, boa tarde a todas, a todos e todes. Sou Sônia Guajajara.
I'm Sônia Guajajara. I come from Brazil, from the Brazilian Amazon. And it's a pure joy to be here with my colleagues and share this table from different parts of the world. And we are here together to bring the voice of indigenous peoples to speak about the importance of the indigenous territories, our waters, our forests, our oceans. For us, what matters is the relationship of respect that we have with Mother Nature. And the world needs to recognize these forms of relationship of indigenous peoples with the environment and with its territories. We, indigenous peoples, are 5% of the world population, but we protect 82% of global biodiversity. If 80% of global biodiversity is protected by indigenous territories, then we need that the cultural rights, the livelihoods of indigenous peoples be respected, that our rights be guaranteed, and international agreements be upheld and implemented in local politics in our countries. We're here at a permanent forum that is an important space for participation for indigenous peoples from around the world. And this voice that here is in the United States now, and needs to be valued in other spaces beyond United Nations. Countries need to understand the urgency of the land use change. It's important to understand the change in the food systems. And we continue to emphasize that we need to guarantee the valuing of the social and bioeconomy of indigenous peoples. It's important to guarantee the conditions for indigenous peoples' management of the land, and including agriculture, according to indigenous people's practices and traditional knowledge. Today, the president of Colombia did really important remarks about how the indigenous peoples are the guardians of the planet, the guardians of our environment. So it is important that the heads of state also can implement those speeches, valuing the livelihoods, respecting the cultures, and guaranteeing the self-management of territories by indigenous peoples. Today we're living a crisis, a climate crisis, an environmental crisis, a justice crisis, but all those crises, it's based on their sources in a civilization crisis. And we indigenous peoples are calling on reforest the mines, a call for solidarity, a call for fraternity, a call to understand the roles of and territories of indigenous peoples for all of humanity. When we fight against illegal mining in our territories, when we fight against oil companies in our territories, when we fight against the expansion of industrial agriculture around our territories, when we fight against the exploitation of logging and timber and the exploitation of our natural resources, against miners that contaminate the waters, contaminating with mercury the waters that our kids drink, the ones who throw pesticides in our agriculture that impact the mothers who, even pregnant, they get contaminated with the pesticides from industrial agriculture. When we do all this fight, we're fighting for the planet and for life. It's a fight for right, for respect, but it's also a fight for life. Today, I'm here as a minister of Brazilian state for the indigenous peoples. It's a once-in-a-kind ministry. It's a new ministry that's putting indigenous peoples in the center, inside the executive branch of the government. Beyond bringing the fight for climate in the center of public debate, we also want to put the issue of indigenous rights at the center of the global negotiations, so that us, we indigenous peoples, can be not just in international agreements like the Paris Agreement, the New York Declaration for Tropical Forests, but that we could have policies that are implemented in the territories to guarantee the demarcation and recognition of our indigenous territories, its protections, the safety of indigenous peoples inside their territories. And I say territories, and I repeat, it's the territories as our sacred lands, our ancestral lands, including our waters, our lands, our forests. For us, the territories is all of that. And I finish here by making a suggestion. I want to propose Brazil could be the next host of the World Indigenous Peoples Congress, Alta plus 10. Like, it happened 10 years ago, and we think that it's important that we do it again, taking back the indigenous leadership and the collective principle of indigenous people's rights. And we do this by also making sure participation of indigenous peoples take place. So I end here, Chair Dario, making that suggestion that we can work together in the permanent forum to organize the next World Congress of Indigenous Peoples in Brazil, taking advantage that I'm a minister of indigenous peoples of my country, so that we can unite all this diversity of indigenous peoples from around the world, so we can discuss and define our strategies to continue bringing our learnings to and our lessons everyone. Never again a Brazil without us. Never again a United Nations without us, indigenous peoples. Thank you so much.
Very much, Minister. Mr. Mejia Montalvo, por favor.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon to all of you. I want to thank you for your kind words. Oh no. I'm sorry, I understand the difficulties that indigenous peoples are facing throughout the earth, especially in Africa and also in some other regions of Asia, where unfortunately we are still behind in advancing in the recognition of Indigenous peoples in the constitutions or in the legal frameworks. The states need to do this, and we need to have this path of recognition at all levels of the world. In all places of the world, Indigenous peoples need to be respected and recognized. And we also need that in those places, in those countries where Indigenous peoples have already been recognized, that we can advance with concrete plans and accelerate the fulfillment of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And here, the presence of our sister, from the Minister of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil. Perhaps this can be an excellent example the states can follow. It's a very good practice in order to duplicate in all the countries, especially starting in those countries that have already recognized Indigenous peoples. And we are at the 22nd session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues here at the United Nations, and the principal topic that has to do with planetary, human, and territorial health is the main theme, and also climate change, a rights-based approach. We will have a lot of contributions, a lot of debates, discussions, and this is the custom that we have here at the Permanent Forum. This is on our agenda, but at this time we want to really call attention to the need that the states have, maybe a need that sometimes we feel that they do not really value, because it's not a need for the elite, but rather it's a planetary need to have the presence of Indigenous peoples in the decision-making spaces when we're faced with these constant global crises. And especially one of the things that we are taught normally in the educational systems is that there are certain resources that are infinite, and that's why they're not really highly valued. And there are other resources that are scarce, and that's why they are worth a lot. But the pandemic really showed us that this is not completely true, that those resources that were considered infinite really are scarce, and those things that were limited are very abundant. So these are, to give two examples. For us, they taught us that time is infinite. But today we realize that that's what we least have. We do not have enough time as humanity. And if life were long and we could conserve it, maybe we would have time. But we don't have that capacity as humanity to continue sustaining life here on this planet. Therefore, time is a very scarce resource at this moment in history. And then also we were taught, especially in an economic sense, that human creativity was scarce, and therefore that intellectual property is very expensive, and that's what we live from, and that's the order of things. But today, we are really realizing, and the pandemic taught humanity, is that human creativity has no limit. And these are things that we have in common. And if human creativity is limitless, then here we are as Indigenous peoples. We want to contribute creativity, knowledge, value systems in order to face these global crises. As Indigenous peoples, we are not saying that we're superior or levels of superiority, nor are we saying that we need to do revolutions or anything. No, we're saying that our values and our knowledge really has to be recognized in order to advance. But the governments need to have humility and be consistent in order to recognize that the solutions until now that have been raised have not been effective. They are not resolving these global crises. And so they need to be consistent to recognize that the international commitments, the declarations, should really be converted and turned into concrete plans, recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I want to continue finalizing this by thanking my from the Minister of Indigenous Peoples, and we would like to have that conference of ALTA plus 10 to have it and for it to be fulfilled in Brazil. It's a very important news for Indigenous peoples of the world, and that will really push forth and encourage the governments to support the second conference on Indigenous peoples here at the United Nations. And we will work very hard to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister, and also the Chairman of the Permanent Forum, second session. I'm here to resonate what my colleagues have said, but also resonate with what the grand opening of the Permanent Forum was today. I think Indigenous peoples bring a lot of ancestral wisdom in terms of also being part of the solution to climate crisis. But the problem is that they are continuously being kept aside, displaced from their territories, to the extent that they lose ground on which they have believed for the common good that they have always done for this world. There's evidence to suggest that territories that are managed and governed by indigenous peoples are much more diverse in terms of natural resources, but also they produce a lot of common goods for the global world. I think what is happening right now in terms of indigenous peoples' lands and territories, I think issues to do with colonial conservation is becoming more traumatic to indigenous people. People are being displaced from their lands, people for extractive industries, for logging of their forests, their water is being commercialized, and indigenous peoples have always kept these resources for the common good, for collective good of all. And this is what the message that we had this morning, and what we are actually calling upon governments to respect the rights of indigenous peoples, their right to collective territories and collective tenure of rights. In July last year, in Africa, Kigali, a conference on African protected areas had made a number of resolutions and a Kigali call to action, in which government agreed to stop further expansion of territories that are called conservation areas. But what we continue saying is we see a number of communities being displaced from their land. They are being, indigenous peoples are becoming actually refugees, climate refugees, but also government are creating their own refugees because of moving people away from their homes. A case of Loliondo in Tanzania is a case on which the Permanent Forum actually issued a statement about this, and there are people already being kept away. I think what needs to be done, and for this to continue happening, is that indigenous people, government need to recognize and respect laws and their own constitutions, that indigenous peoples, whatever they are part of the solution to climate crisis. And if you want, we all of us are working towards a healthy ecosystem, healthy environment, and also healthy people. And for this to happen, justice, rights must be respected. I think what other mechanism can be brought in is, I think, dialogue between indigenous peoples and government, to also bring up other co-creation or co-management of these resources for the benefit of all, instead of moving people away from their lands. And I think, to me, this is very important to avoid much more conflict in these areas. But also, if we continue moving people away from their lands and territories, we cannot meet the goals, SDGs goal. We cannot meet the global biodiversity goals. We actually be missing the target. And for this to happen, I think we need to exactly do what the government of Brazil is doing, ensuring that people are the center of conservation, and also what the president of Colombia said this morning, that at least people should not be displaced for capitalistic kind of gains. And this is exactly what Africans government need to do. There is no risk respecting and recognizing indigenous people's rights. In fact, by diversity of both ecosystems and people is what bring real benefit of biodiversity. And to me, this is the message to the African government, but also a number of the African court has made a number of very progressive rules in terms of government to stop displacement of people. For instance, the case of Ogiek in Kenyan government. And also the African court ruled that Ogiek are indigenous peoples and they should not be displaced from the Ogiek, the Mau forest. These are some of the key things that we really need to respect so that we can all live in harmony with the environment and we can all collectively work towards the climate crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And now we will just open the floor to questions. Stefano?
Thank you, Stefano Vaccara, La Voce di New York. This first question to the Minister and the Chairperson on the speech that Secretary General Guterres did for the opening of the event. If there was something that you expected, I mean, was the speech exactly what you were expecting, or if you could have inserted there a topic or something that you didn't find? And then about the situation in Africa. We heard the last years that Africa is becoming again a field of competition between new powers coming there to invest. So China is ahead of the United States, has to catch up, and so on. What is your opinion about what this is? Is it being Chinese, if you want, help to Africa, if you want to call it help, or new initiative in investing in Africa have been like way you wish it will be, or you have a message for whoever power wants to come and invest in Africa? Do you have a message for from them?
Thank you. Who would like to start? Minister?
I'm going to continue to call in the speeches the respect to indigenous peoples, to indigenous peoples' rights, to the livelihoods, and that every speech about speech and justice to be implemented in practice. There is a lot of talking about respect, but indigenous peoples don't feel this in their daily lives. So I always emphasize that we need to implement the rights and the justice, and not just put in the speeches.
Gracias.
Thank you for your question. First of all, the General Secretary had not been for a very long time to the sessions of the Permanent Forum. I think that maybe the last time that a General Secretary attended was in 2011. So I think that it was very valuable that he was there at the opening of this 22nd session. And then I do agree with what my sister, the minister, says here, that we always celebrate the good declarations that come from leaders, but we need to advance in the UN system so that in the decision-making spaces we can advance in equal footing, inequality, to put on the same level traditional systems, knowledge system, traditional indigenous authorities. We've never delegated our words or so we need to advance in the dialogue and we need to be on equal footing. But we do recognize that there are good declarations and manifest statements. Yes, I know you have to leave in a little bit to go to the meeting.
Mr. Ole, stay to address the last question.
Yeah, thank you so much about the question about investment in Africa. I think Chinese are not the only ones actually investing in Africa. And I think from the 1880s Berlin Conference, Partition for Africa, I think there's now another second kind of partition on Africa in terms of investment of different streams of work. One of the issues is African governments are torn in between. They need income to be able to pay the cost of their to offer services to their own citizens, but at the same time, their negotiating power in terms of being able to negotiate for the betterment of their own people is actually very weak in terms of a number of issues. There are number of investment. Chinese are coming in terms of infrastructural investment. They are all over Africa. The case of Loliondo in Tanzania is not actually a Chinese issue. It's an Arab issue where an hunting ground is being created from a Maasai land. If you look also, European governments, I come from an area where renewable energy companies are displacing people because of creating renewable energy. So the question will be, which one is much more better? Those are fairness in terms of using the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. These are the questions that are at play. But to be honest, Africa is getting a raw deal from all these kind of streams of income. It's only another question will be which is a better deal, and I think that's a question that European as well as other governments need to respond to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We thank you all, and good luck in your next meeting. Thank you, everybody.